Imagine being invited somewhere not to be celebrated, not to be included, but to be used as the punchline of a cruel joke in front of the most dangerous people in the city. That was what happened to Imani Walker. Imani worked as a maid for the elite. She scrubbed floors, polished silver, and moved like a shadow through cold, marble hallways. Most people looked right through her, treating her like she was just another piece of the expensive scenery. So when the invitation arrived, it felt surreal, almost like a nightmare. It was for a high-profile gala hosted by Jang Min's CEO, the socialite ex-fiancée of the city's most feared mafia boss, Baek Hyun-woo. But what Imani did not know was that this invitation was laced with venom. It was not a gesture of kindness. It was a social execution. Min's CEO wanted to humiliate Imani to make a point about status, expecting her to show up looking like a joke for the amusement of the wealthy. But life has a way of flipping the script. Because on the night of that gala, the woman they planned to laugh at, the woman they thought was lesser, walked in like royalty. What happened when the doors opened? Nobody could have imagined. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. Enjoy the story. The sound of designer heels clicked rhythmically across the sterile, polished floors of the penthouse. The surface was so clean it acted like a mirror for the cold, crystal chandeliers overhead. Outside, black armored sedans and luxury sports cars lined the private driveway. Inside this world, power wasn't just held, it was brandished like a weapon. The morning sun in Seoul didn't rise so much as it reflected, bouncing off the glass monoliths of the Gangnam district and bleeding into the cold, white marble of the Jang penthouse. For Imani Walker, the day didn't begin with the aroma of coffee or the warmth of a blanket. It began with the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of stiletto heels on stone. It was a sound that acted as a countdown, a warning that the peace of her morning was about to be shattered. Imani knelt on the floor of the master suite, her hands encased in yellow rubber gloves, scrubbing at a microscopic blemish on the baseboard. At 30 years old, Imani possessed a face that belonged on a vintage coin, symmetrical, dignified, and carved with a quiet resilience. But in this house, she was taught to be a ghost. She was the shadow that emptied the wastebaskets, the phantom that fluffed the pillows, and the silent witness to a world that saw her as a biological extension of a vacuum cleaner. The heels stopped just inches from her knees. Imani didn't look up, but she could smell the suffocatingly sweet scent of expensive lilies and arrogance. "You missed a spot, Imani," a voice purred. It was a melodic sound, but it carried the jagged edge of a serrated knife. Jang Min's CEO stood over her, draped in a silk robe that cost more than Imani's yearly rent. Min's CEO was the kind of woman whose beauty was weaponized, sharp eyes, a porcelain complexion, and a smile that never reached her soul. As the ex-fiancée of Baek Hyun-woo, the man whose name was whispered with terror in the city's dark alleys and with reverence in its boardrooms, Min's CEO clung to her fading relevance by crushing those beneath her. Imani dipped her brush back into the bucket. "I'll go over it again, Miss Jang." "You do that. Although I wonder." Min's CEO paused, tapping a perfectly manicured chin. "Is it a lack of vision? Or is it just that your people aren't accustomed to this level of cleanliness? I suppose in the slums you come from, a little dirt is just part of the decor." Imani's grip tightened on the scrub brush until her knuckles turned a ghostly shade beneath her skin. A flash of a memory, a gala in Washington, D.C., the scent of real lilies, her father's laughter as he shook hands with a prime minister, flickered in her mind. She shoved it down. That Imani was dead. That Imani had been buried under the weight of a scandal she hadn't caused and a poverty she hadn't earned. "I will ensure it is spotless," Imani said, her voice a calm, low vibration. She had learned that the best way to survive a predator like Min's CEO was to provide no friction. If you were a mirror, they eventually grew tired of looking at themselves. Min's CEO let out a soft, tittering laugh. "So robotic. Honestly, sometimes I think Hyun-woo kept you around just because you're so sturdy." like a pack animal. She reached out, using the toe of her designer slipper to nudge Imani's bucket, splashing gray water onto Imani's uniform. Oops. Now look at you. Even more of a mess than usual. Imani looked down at the dark stains spreading across her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply took a rag and began to wipe her own uniform with the same methodical precision she used on the floors. This was the daily psychological warfare. 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed out her dignity until there was nothing left but a shell. Min-seo watched her for a moment, her eyes narrowing. She hated Imani's silence. She hated the way Imani's back stayed straight, even when she was on her knees. Most of all, she hated that she couldn't break the spirit of the woman who folded her laundry. "I'm having a gala soon," Min-seo said suddenly, her voice shifting into a tone of false excitement. "The Grand Seoul Ballroom. Everyone will be there. Even Hyunwoo." At the mention of the name, the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. Baek Hyunwoo was a man of shadows and steel. Imani had seen him only a handful of times, a tall, imposing figure with a gaze that felt like it could strip a person's secrets bare. He had been the one to authorize her hiring, though he had never spoken a word to her. "That sounds like a significant event, Miss Jang," Imani replied. "Oh, it will be. It's a celebration of excellence," Min-seo sneered, a wicked glint appearing in her eyes. "And I've decided that you've worked so hard, Imani. You deserve to see how the other half lives. Up close. Very, very up close." Min-seo turned on her heel, her silk robe fluttering like the wings of a predatory bird. As she walked toward her vanity, she glanced back over her shoulder. "Don't work too hard on those floors. You'll need your energy. I have a very special role in mind for you." Imani remained on the floor, the cold water from the bucket seeping into her skin. She looked at her reflection in the polished marble, a distorted, dark shape against a sea of white. To Min-seo, she was a joke, a prop, a tool for humiliation. But as Imani squeezed the water from her rag, her eyes didn't look like the eyes of a maid. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent years learning the layout of the fortress from the inside. She knew which floorboards creaked, which cameras had blind spots, and exactly what the elite whispered when they thought the furniture wasn't listening. Min-seo thought she was inviting a maid to a joke. She didn't realize she was inviting a ghost to a haunting. And for the first time in a long time, the shadow in the suite began to feel the faint, flickering warmth of a fire that had long since been thought extinguished. The warfare had been one-sided for too long, and as Imani looked at the invitation sitting on the nightstand, she knew that the silence was finally about to end. The next few days were a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Min-seo didn't just want to invite Imani to the gala. She wanted to savor the anticipation of the humiliation. She ensured Imani was constantly in her line of sight, assigning her the most menial, degrading tasks, scrubbing the grout in the guest bathrooms with a toothbrush while Min-seo sat nearby, describing the exquisite fabrics of the gowns her real friends would be wearing. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt heavier than the rest, the trap was officially sprung. Imani was in the formal living room, steam cleaning the heavy velvet drapes that framed the panoramic view of the Seoul skyline. The humid air was thick and cloying, making her uniform cling to her back. She heard the familiar, sharp click of heels approaching, but this time there was a second set of footsteps, heavier, more deliberate. Imani didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She felt the sudden drop in temperature that always accompanied the presence of Baek Hyunwoo. "Min-seo, I don't have time for this," a deep, resonant voice rumbled. It was the first time Imani had heard the Mafia Boss speak so close to her. His voice sounded like gravel grinding over silk, dangerous, polished, and absolute. "Oh, just 1 second, Hyunwoo. I have a surprise for our most dedicated staff member," Min-seo chirped. Her voice was bright, but the malice beneath it was blinding. Imani switched off the steamer and stood, turning slowly. Min-seo stood there, looking radiant in a white tailored suit, holding a stiff, cream-colored envelope embossed with gold leaf. Behind her, Baek Hyun-woo stood like a statue carved from obsidian. He was perfectly groomed, his black suit tailored so sharply it looked like armor, and the faint edge of a tattoo peeked out from his collar, hinting at the violence he commanded. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered to Imani for a fraction of a second before returning to his ex-fiancée. "Imani," Min Seo said, stepping forward with a grin that was far too wide. "I've been thinking. It's so tragic that you spend your life cleaning up after beautiful events, but never actually get to attend one. So consider this a gift." She thrust the envelope toward Imani. The gold leaf shimmered mockingly under the crystal chandeliers. "The Foundation Gala," Min Seo announced. "It's the event of the season, and you, my dear, are officially invited." Imani reached out, her fingers grazing the expensive cardstock. She felt the weight of it, not just the paper, but the intent. She knew exactly what this was. Min Seo wanted a caricature. She wanted to show the world's elite that the only black woman in the room was the one who scrubbed the toilets, and she likely intended to dress her in something that emphasized the joke. I don't know what to say, Miss Jang," Imani said softly, keeping her eyes cast downward, playing the role of the overwhelmed servant. Min Seo let out a sharp, delighted laugh, turning to Hyun-woo. "Look at her. She's speechless. She probably doesn't even have anything to wear that isn't polyester. Don't worry, Imani. I've already thought of that. I have an old dress in the back of my closet. It's a bit garish, bright neon yellow with some interesting ruffles. It'll be perfect for you. You'll look just like a little tropical bird among the swans." The insult was naked and ugly. Min Seo was essentially telling her she would be dressed as a clown, a vibrant eyesore meant to draw gazes of pity and ridicule. Hyun-woo remained silent, but his jaw tightened. He looked at the envelope in Imani's hand, then at the smudge of gray water still visible on her shoulder from the previous day. "Is this necessary, Min Seo?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's charity, darling." Min Seo laughed, oblivious to the storm brewing in his eyes. "Every gala needs a bit of entertainment. Besides, imagine the photos. The Maid and the Mafia. It's practically a fairy tale, isn't it?" She turned back to Imani, her expression hardening into something predatory. "Make sure you're there by 8 sharp. Use the service entrance, obviously. And don't bother with your hair. Just keep it neat. We wouldn't want people thinking you're trying too hard to be someone you aren't." The cruelty was a physical weight in the room. Min Seo was laughing at a woman she thought was broken, using her as a weapon to annoy an ex-lover who had clearly moved on. She saw Imani as a blank canvas upon which she could paint her own arrogance. "I will be there," Imani said, her voice steady. She looked up then, just for a moment, and her eyes met Hyun-woo's. For a heartbeat, there was a spark of recognition, not as boss and servant, but as two people who understood the power of a mask. "Good," Min Seo said, satisfied. "Now get back to those drapes. They're still looking a bit dusty, and I want this place perfect before the pre-party." As they walked away, Imani heard Min Seo's receding laughter, a high, tinkling sound that echoed off the cold marble. She looked down at the gold-embossed invitation in her hand. The trap was set. Min Seo expected a victim. She expected a woman who would show up in a neon yellow rag, head bowed in shame, to be laughed at by the photographers. But as Imani gripped the invitation, her thumb smoothed over the gold leaf. She wasn't thinking about the neon dress. She was thinking about the locked box under her bed. She was thinking about the deep red silk that had been hidden away for years. The color of power, the color of blood, the color of a woman who was done being invisible. Min Seo had given her an invitation to her own funeral, but she didn't realize that Imani Walker was the one who knew how to bury a body. The cleaning lady was about to sweep the floor with the entire elite of Seoul, and the only one who wouldn't be laughing was the woman who had set the stage. The heavy silence of the penthouse was replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of the city as Imani retreated to the tiny studio apartment she called home. It was a space that smelled of lemon floor wax and cheap laundry detergent, a stark contrast to the cloying floral perfumes of the Jang estate. For months, she had used this room as a cocoon, a place to disappear after a day of being treated like a ghost. But tonight, the air felt different. It felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm breaks over the Han River. Imani sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her knees pressing against the small wooden trunk she kept tucked beneath the frame. Her hands, still red from the day's labor, trembled slightly as she pulled it out. This box was the only thing that remained of the life she had once lived. The life that had ended in a flurry of headlines, frozen bank accounts, and the sudden, terrifying silence of fair-weather friends. She clicked the lock open. On top sat a small, blue book, her United States diplomatic passport. She opened it, staring at the photo of the woman inside. The woman in the picture didn't look like a maid. She was younger, yes, but her eyes held a spark of fire that Imani had spent a year trying to extinguish. That woman had spent her summers in Martha's Vineyard and her winters at embassy balls in Paris. She had been the daughter of Ambassador Marcus Walker, a man who taught her that a person's dignity was their only true currency. Beside the passport lay a folded piece of heavy, hand-painted silk, a scarf in shades of deep emerald and gold. It was a gift from a high-ranking official in Tokyo, given to her during her father's final posting. Imani ran her thumb over the delicate fabric, feeling the contrast between the luxury of the silk and the calluses on her palms. For a long time, she had stayed hidden out of a sense of misplaced shame. When the scandal had broken, a complex web of political framing that had stripped her father of his title and their family of their fortune, Imani had fled to Seoul, thinking that the only way to survive was to become small, to become invisible. She had convinced herself that scrubbing floors was a way to pay penance for a name that had been dragged through the mud. But Min Seo's laughter still echoed in her ears, sharp and poisonous. "A little tropical bird among the swans," she had said. The memory made Imani's blood run cold, then white-hot. Min Seo didn't just want to mock a cleaning lady. She wanted to mock the very idea of Imani's humanity. She wanted to turn Imani into a prop for her own vanity, a tool to provoke a man who clearly no longer cared for her. "No more," Imani whispered into the quiet room. The words felt like a vow. She realized then that by hiding, she wasn't protecting her father's legacy. She was helping her enemies bury it. Her father hadn't raised her to be a shadow. He had raised her to be a bridge, a leader, a woman who could walk into any room and command it without saying a word. She picked up the diplomatic passport and tucked it into her bag. Then she took the silk scarf and tied it around her wrist, the gold threads shimmering in the dim light of her single lamp. The shame that had been her constant companion for the last year began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Min Seo expected a victim. She expected a woman who would cower in a neon yellow rag, grateful for the crumbs of attention from a world that had discarded her. She expected the cleaning lady to show up through the service entrance, smelling of bleach and defeat. Imani stood up, her posture shifting, her back straightened, her chin lifted, and the weary slump of the maid vanished. She looked at the invitation on her small table, the gold leaf that Min Seo thought was a leash. It wasn't a leash. It was a key. She wouldn't be wearing neon yellow. She wouldn't be entering through the service door. And she certainly wouldn't be asking for permission. Imani Walker was done being a ghost. If the elite of Seoul wanted a show, she would give them one they would never forget. She would show them exactly who they were dealing with. And she would do it with the grace her father had instilled in her and the steel she had forged in the dark. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over a contact she hadn't called in years. It was time to call in a favor. It was time for the diplomat's daughter to return to the world, not as a guest, but as a queen reclaiming her throne. The trap had been set, but Min Seo had forgotten one crucial detail. A trap only works if the prey doesn't know how to turn it into a weapon. The dial tone was a lonely sound in the quiet apartment, a bridge stretching across a distance that was measured in more than just miles. When the line finally clicked open, there was a heavy silence on the other end, the kind of silence that comes from a person who recognizes a ghost number on their screen. Imani. The voice was raspy, cultured, and laced with a disbelief that nearly broke Imani's composure. "Is that really you? My God, child, where have you been?" "I've been underground, Julian," Imani replied, her voice steadying as she leaned against the peeling wallpaper of her kitchen. "But the air is getting thin. I need to come up." Julian St. Clair had been her father's most trusted advisor, a man who understood the architecture of power and the importance of the right silhouette. In the old world, he was the man who dressed the wives of presidents. In the new world, he was a silent partner in the most exclusive fashion houses in Asia. 2 hours later, Imani was standing in the back of a nondescript tailor shop in a quiet corner of Itaewon. The front of the shop sold traditional handbags to tourists, but the back, accessible only through a heavy velvet curtain, was a cathedral of high couture. Julian looked older, his hair a shock of silver against his mahogany skin, but his eyes were as sharp as the shears tucked into his vest. He didn't ask her about the scandal or why she had been scrubbing floors in a Mafia Boss's penthouse. He simply walked around her twice, his hands moving through the air as if he were sculpting her out of the shadows. "Min Seo wants to humiliate you," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low growl after Imani explained the situation. "She wants to dress you in neon yellow. She wants you to look like a desperate imitation of a life she thinks you can't have. She wants a joke," Imani said, her eyes meeting his in the tall, triptych mirror. "She wants everyone to laugh when I walk through the door." Julian's lips thinned into a predatory smile. "Then we won't give her a joke. We will give her a reckoning." In the diplomatic corps, Imani, your dress isn't just clothing. It's a statement of intent. It's a declaration of war without a single shot being fired. He disappeared into a climate-controlled vault at the back of the room and emerged moments later carrying a garment bag that seemed to hum with its own energy. When he unzipped it, the light in the room seemed to change. The fabric was a silk so deep and rich it looked like a pool of spilled burgundy, the color of old wine, of dried blood, of power that had been aged in the dark. "This is your armor," Julian whispered. Imani stepped into the gown. It fit her like a second skin, the structured bodice cinching her waist while the skirt flowed down her legs like a river. But it was the white cape that changed everything. It was architectural, draped over her shoulders with a rigid authority that mimicked the military uniforms of her ancestors. It wasn't meant to hide her, it was meant to frame her. As Julian pinned the final hem, Imani looked at herself. The maid was gone. The woman in the mirror was poised, unreadable, and terrifyingly beautiful. She didn't look like someone who had ever held a scrub brush. She looked like a woman who could move mountains with a whisper. "She told me to use the service entrance," Imani murmured, touching the structured white fabric of the cape. "You will enter through the front doors," Julian corrected her, stepping back to admire his work. "And you will not walk. You will arrive. You carry the walker name, Imani. Your father was a man who brokered peace between nations. You are not a tropical bird. You are the storm." He reached into a velvet tray and pulled out a minimal, elegant pendant necklace and a matching bracelet. They were simple, but carried the unmistakable weight of real gold and craftsmanship. He fastened them around her neck and wrist with the solemnity of a knight being dubbed. Min Seo has forgotten that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has seen the bottom and survived it, Julian said. She thinks she is playing a game with a servant. She has no idea she has invited a queen to her own execution. Imani turned her head, the sleek, chin-length bob of her hair catching the light. She felt the silk against her skin and the weight of the gold on her wrist. The transformation was physical, but the true change was happening deeper in the marrow of her bones. The fear that had kept her small for a year was being burned away by a cold, crystalline purpose. She wasn't just going to the gala to survive. She was going to reclaim the narrative. She was going to show Baek Hyun-woo and the rest of the world that you can take away a person's money, and you can take away their title, but you can never take away their bloodline. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice sounding like a bell in a quiet shop. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his eyes gleaming with a reflected fire. "Just make sure that when you walk into that ballroom, you don't give them a single smile. Let them wonder why the woman they thought was a joke looks like the woman who owns their souls." Imani nodded once. She left the shop through the front door this time, her stride steady, her shoulders back. The armor was ready. The trap was set. But the hunters were about to find out that they had invited a wolf into the fold, and she was very, very hungry for justice. The Grand Seoul Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and ego, a place where the air tasted of vintage champagne and the silent desperation of those trying to stay relevant. It was the Night of the Wolves, a gathering of the city's most formidable predators, all dressed in silk and diamonds to hide the sharp teeth beneath their smiles. Above, 10 massive crystal chandeliers pulsed with a light that made everything seem sharper, colder, and more expensive than it actually was. At the center of it all stood Jang Min-seo. She was a vision in a tailored white suit that clung to her frame with aggressive precision, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it made her high cheekbones look like glass. She held a glass of champagne with the casual indifference of a woman who expected the world to bow. To the casual observer, she was the queen of the evening. To those who knew the politics of the underworld, she was a woman performing a frantic dance on the edge of cliff. Her eyes constantly flickered toward the grand mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom. She wasn't looking for her business partners, nor was she looking for the press. She was waiting for the arrival of her masterpiece, the punchline that would restore her status as the most clever woman in Seoul. "You look distracted, Min-seo," a voice murmured beside her. Min-seo turned to see a cluster of socialites, their eyes glittering with the predatory curiosity that defined their circle. They were the silent jury of the evening, the ones who would decide if Min-seo's little joke was a stroke of genius or a desperate cry for attention. "Distracted? Not at all," Min-seo replied, her smile widening into something brittle. "I'm just anticipating a special guest. I've decided to add a little flavor to the evening, a reminder of where true grace comes from and where it doesn't." She checked her diamond-encrusted watch. It was nearly 8:15. By now, Imani should have arrived. Min-seo had spent the afternoon imagining the scene. The maid, smelling of cheap detergent and nervous sweat, stumbling through the service entrance in that hideous, neon yellow ruffled monstrosity. She imagined the way the photographers would snicker, the way the whispers would ripple through the crowd like a virus, and the way Baek Hyun-woo would be forced to look at the low quality of the woman who cleaned his floors. In Min-seo's mind, this was the ultimate move. By turning Imani into a spectacle, she was subtly telling Hyun-woo that his world was losing its standards since he left her. She was reclaiming her territory by marking the help. Across the room, standing near a towering display of ice and caviar, was Baek Hyun-woo. He was a silent monolith in a sea of noise. His black suit absorbed the light, making him seem like a shadow cast by the room itself. He held no drink. He made no small talk. His gaze was fixed on the entrance, his expression as unreadable as a closed tomb. The faint tattoo on his neck pulsed as his jaw tightened, a silent indicator that he was aware of the trap Min-seo had set. He had spent the evening being approached by men who feared him and women who wanted to tame him, but his focus never wavered from the doors. "She's late," one of Min-seo's friends whispered, leaning in close. "Do you think she got cold feet?" Perhaps she realized a janitor doesn't belong among the lions. "Oh, she'll be here," Min-seo sneered, taking a long sip of her drink. "She needs the job too much to disappear. She's probably stuck at the service gate, trying to explain to the guards why she looks like a high-visibility traffic cone. Just wait." The moment she walks in, the cameras will do the rest of the work for us. Min Seo signaled to a group of photographers she had personally tipped off. They shifted their positions, lenses trained on the back in trance, their fingers hovering over the shutters. They were ready to capture the moment of Imani's greatest shame and broadcast it to every tabloid in the country. The air was thick with the scent of an impending kill. Min Seo felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of power she hadn't felt since her engagement was called off. She was in control again. She was the director, and Imani Walker was merely the prop. But as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The usual hum of conversation grew a fraction lower. The guests, sensing Min Seo's frequent glances at the door, began to follow her gaze. A strange, expectant silence started to bleed from the edges of the ballroom toward the center. Min Seo didn't notice the change at first. She was too busy rehearsing the biting remark she would deliver when Imani finally appeared. She was too busy savoring the image of Imani's bowed head and the neon ruffles that would serve as her shroud. Then, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance, not the service door, but the grand portal reserved for diplomats and royalty, began to swing open. The sound was heavy, a dull thud that echoed through the cavernous space. The music from a string quartet didn't stop, but the musicians seemed to falter, their bows dragging across the strings as their eyes drifted toward the light pouring in from the foyer. Min Seo frowned, her wine glass pausing halfway to her lips. That wasn't where the joke was supposed to enter. That was the wrong door. "Who is that?" someone whispered. The photographers, sensing a shift in the gravity of the room, began to pivot. They lowered their cameras from the back service door and turned them toward the main entrance. The wolves of Seoul stood frozen, their glasses half raised, their secrets momentarily forgotten. The light from the foyer was blinding, creating a silhouette that seemed to fill the entire frame of the doorway. It wasn't the shape of a woman in a ruffled yellow dress. It wasn't the shape of a maid with her head down. It was a silhouette of sharp angles, a structured white cape that looked like wings, and a presence that felt like a physical weight pressing against the chests of everyone in the room. Min Seo's hand began to shake just a little. The champagne in her glass rippled, reflecting the crystal lights above. The joke she had spent weeks preparing suddenly felt like ash in her mouth. Because as the figure stepped forward out of the light and into the ballroom, the silence that followed wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of a crowd that had just realized they weren't the hunters anymore. The Night of the Wolves had just begun, but as the woman in the deep red gown took her first step onto the marble, every predator in the room realized that a true queen had arrived to claim her throne. The heavy mahogany doors didn't just open. They parted with a weight that seemed to alter the very oxygen in the ballroom. The light from the grand foyer flooded in, a white-hot tide that washed over the polished marble and swallowed the dim, amber glow of the party. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint, rhythmic whir of the ventilation system. Then, Imani Walker stepped into the frame. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The string quartet, mid-crescendo, didn't stop playing, but the notes seemed to thin out, becoming a ghostly, distant soundtrack to a moment that had frozen time. Men who had been mid-laugh remained with their mouths open. Women who had been whispering turned with their glasses paused at their lips. Imani moved with a steady, unhurried cadence that spoke of generations of bloodlines used to being the center of gravity. She didn't look for a place to fit in because she occupied the room by right of existence. The deep burgundy silk of her gown was so rich it looked like it was absorbing the light of the chandeliers, and a structured white cape draped over her shoulders provided a stark, regal contrast that made her look like a high priestess of a world they hadn't been invited to. Her hair, styled in a sleek, razor-sharp bob, caught the light with every deliberate tilt of her head. Her jewelry was minimal. The gold pendant Julian had fastened, but against her mahogany skin, it glowed with the authority of an artifact. Her expression was the most terrifying thing of all. It was perfectly, beautifully unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph, and certainly no shame. There was only certainty. The photographers, who had been huddled near the back service entrance waiting for a joke in neon yellow, stood paralyzed for 3 seconds before their instincts overrode their shock. They pivoted as one, their heavy lenses swinging toward the main entrance. The first flash went off, a blinding pop of white, followed by another, and then a rapid-fire staccato of shutters that sounded like a hail of bullets hitting glass. Min Seo stood at the center of the floor, her wine glass trembling so violently that the pale liquid began to slop over the rim. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly agape, her carefully constructed mask of porcelain perfection cracking in real time. She looked down at her own white suit, the suit she thought signaled her dominance, and suddenly felt invisible. The woman she had spent weeks trying to erase was now the only thing anyone could see. Who is she? The whispers finally broke through the silence, rippling like a physical wave. Is it the American ambassador's daughter? I thought she left the country years ago. Imani didn't acknowledge the whispers. She didn't acknowledge the cameras. She walked straight toward the heart of the room, her chin level, her shoulders back. Every step she took was a silent funeral for the cleaning lady Min Seo had tried to create. She wasn't walking like a maid who had been given a gift. She was walking like a creditor who had come to collect a very old debt. The crowd parted before her like a receding tide. People who had looked through her for months as she scrubbed their floors now took instinctive steps backward, granting her a wide, respectful berth. The power shift was so instantaneous and so absolute that it felt like the floor had tilted beneath their feet. In the background, Baek Hyun-woo finally moved. He didn't approach her with the hurried pace of a protector, but with the measured stride of a man who had finally found what he was looking for. He stepped into the light behind her, his sharp black suit acting as a dark shadow to her vibrant red. He stood still, his neck tattoo visible above the collar, his observant gaze scanning the room with a cold, territorial warning. He didn't say a word, but his presence behind her was a seal of approval that shattered whatever was left of Min Seo's plan. Min Seo leaned back slightly, her body signaling an emotional disruption so deep it looked like she might collapse. She had expected to be the director of a comedy. Instead, she found herself the villain in a tragedy of her own making. The black maid she had invited to mock hadn't just arrived. She had taken over. As the cameras continued to flash, turning the moment into a permanent public record, Imani finally came to a halt. She was the anchor of the scene, the calm eye of a social hurricane. She didn't need to speak to be heard. The silence of the room, the shock on Min Seo's face, and the protective shadow of the city's most dangerous man behind her said everything. The arrival was complete. The joke was over, and the reckoning had officially begun. The silence in the ballroom didn't break. It thickened. It became the kind of heavy, pressurized air that exists before a lightning strike. Imani stood at the epicenter of it, her gaze fixed forward, her presence so commanding that the opulence of the Grand Seoul ballroom seemed to shrink around her. But the true shift in the room's gravity occurred when the shadow behind her finally took form. Baek Hyun-woo moved with a predatory grace that made the crowd's collective breath hitch. He did not rush to her side like a man seeking to explain away a mistake, nor did he look at the photographers whose shutters were now a frantic, metallic heartbeat. He stepped into the light, closing the distance until he was a solid, dark anchor behind Imani's vibrant red. He was the most feared man in the city, a titan of the underworld whose smile was rarer than a lunar eclipse. And yet, as he came to a halt, his focus was singular. He didn't spare a single glance for the woman in white standing 10 feet away. He didn't look at Jang Min Seo, his former fiancée, who was currently trembling with a glass of champagne that threatened to shatter in her grip. To Hyun-woo, the woman who had orchestrated this entire joke simply no longer existed. He looked only at Imani. It wasn't the look of a boss checking on an employee. It was an acknowledgement, a silent, public bowing of one power to another. His dark eyes scanned her, from the razor-sharp bob of her hair to the structured white cape that signaled her hidden history. In that look, there was a deep, resonant respect. He saw the diplomat's daughter. He saw the woman who had scrubbed his floors with a straight back and a silent soul. He saw the queen who had finally decided to stop hiding. "You're late," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the vacuum of the ballroom, it carried like a gunshot. It wasn't a reprimand. It was an invitation. Imani finally turned her head slightly, her profile etched in gold by the chandeliers. "A woman like me arrives exactly when she intends to, Mr. Beck." A ghost of a smirk, something the elite of Seoul would spend years talking about, tugged at the corner of Hyun-woo's mouth. He inclined his head, a gesture of submission that sent a physical shockwave through the guests. By standing behind her, by offering her his undivided attention, he had rewritten the social order of the evening. He wasn't her protector. He was her witness. Min Seo took a staggering step forward, her face a mask of pale horror. "Hyun-woo, what is this? This is a mistake. She's the maid. She's the woman who cleans your penthouse. I invited her as a gesture of pity." The mention of the word maid usually would have been the killing blow in a room this shallow. But tonight it fell flat. It sounded small, desperate, and shrill against the quiet dignity of the pair standing at the center of the floor. Hyun-woo finally shifted his gaze, but it wasn't to look at Min Seo. It was to look at the photographers. His eyes were cold, obsidian voids that promised a very specific kind of ruin for anyone who dared to print a mockery of this moment. The flashes didn't stop, but the angle changed. They were no longer trying to catch a janitor in a dress. They were documenting the arrival of a new power dynamic. "Min Seo," Hyun-woo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He still didn't look at her, his eyes returning to Imani as if drawn by a magnetic force. "You've always had a problem recognizing value. You see a surface and think you know the depth. You thought you were bringing a joke into this room. Instead, you brought the only person here whose name will be remembered when yours is forgotten." He reached out, not to touch Imani, but to gesture toward the lead table, the seat of honor that had been reserved for the most important guest of the evening. It was a seat Min Seo had intended to keep empty to signify her own unmatched status. "Shall we?" he asked Imani. Imani didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Min Seo's crumbling expression or the wine glass that finally slipped from the socialite's hand, splashing red liquid across her white designer shoes like a fresh wound. Imani simply nodded, her hand coming up to adjust the white cape with a flick of her wrist that was pure, inherited elegance. As they walked together, the crowd didn't just part, they bowed. It was instinctive. It was the reaction of people who realized they were in the presence of someone who didn't need their approval to be important. Baek Hyun-woo walked half a step behind her, a dark shadow to her brilliant flame. He was the most dangerous man in Seoul, a king of the shadows. And yet, as he escorted Imani Walker through the sea of stunned wolves, it was clear to everyone watching. He wasn't the one leading. He was the one following the queen back to her throne. The sound of the wine glass hitting the marble was like a gunshot in a library. It didn't just shatter. It exploded, sending shards of crystal and sprays of red liquid across the pristine white hem of Min Seo's designer suit. The stains spread rapidly, a jagged, crimson Rorschach test that mirrored the sudden disintegration of her composure. For a woman who lived and breathed for the optics of perfection, the sight of the dark red blood on her white armor was the final straw. This isn't possible, Min Seo stammered, her voice losing its melodic lilt and ascending into a shrill, desperate pitch. She looked down at the mess on her shoes, then back at Imani, who stood perfectly still, watching her with the detached curiosity one might afford a flickering light bulb. You were supposed to be in the kitchen. You're supposed to be wearing that rag. I gave it to you. I told you to wear it." The crowd gasped. The word yellow hung in the air like a foul odor. In the high-stakes world of Seoul's elite, cruelty was expected, but lack of refinement was a cardinal sin. By admitting to the joke so loudly, Min Seo had stripped away the thin veil of her own sophistication, revealing the hollow, bitter insecurity beneath. The photographers, sensing the shift from a power arrival to a public execution, didn't miss a beat. The flashes intensified, capturing every vein popping in Min Seo's neck, every frantic twitch of her eyes, and the way her polished facade was melting like wax too close to a flame. They caught the stark contrast. The frantic, stained woman in white screaming at a calm, regal woman in deep red who hadn't even raised her voice. "Min Seo, you're making a scene," a voice whispered from the crowd. One of her own friends, already taking a step back to avoid the social fallout. "I'm making a scene," Min Seo shrieked, her eyes wild as she looked around the room. "She's a maid. Do you hear me? She cleans the dirt off the floors. She's a nobody. Hyunwoo, tell them. Tell them she's just the help you hired because she was cheap and quiet." Baek Hyunwoo didn't move a muscle. He remained a dark, immovable pillar behind Imani, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't offer a word of defense for Imani because he knew she didn't need it. His silence was more devastating than any shout. It was the silence of a man who had already deleted someone from his ledger. Imani took a single step forward, the white cape fluttering slightly, like the settling of a hawk's wings. She didn't look at the mess on the floor. She looked directly into Min Seo's eyes. "The problem with people like you, Min Seo," Imani said, her voice a low, melodic contrast to the socialite's hysteria, "is that you believe status is something you put on in the morning and take off at night. You think a uniform defines the soul. But I have been a diplomat's daughter, and I have been a maid. And through both, I was still Imani Walker. Can you say the same? If you took away that suit in this ballroom, who would be left?" Min Seo lunged forward, her hand raised as if to strike, but she froze. It wasn't because Hyunwoo moved. It was because an older man in a navy diplomatic suit stepped out from the inner circle of guests. He was a veteran of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a man whose word was law in international circles. "Imani," the man asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Imani Walker? Daughter of Marcus?" The room went deathly silent. The name Walker carried a weight that even the Mafia's influence couldn't override. It was a name associated with treaties, with global summits, and with a legacy of service that spanned decades. Imani turned her head slightly and offered a small, dignified nod. "It has been a long time, Minister Choi." The minister ignored Min Seo entirely, stepping over the shattered glass to take Imani's hand. After the scandal, we thought your family had disappeared. My dear, if we had known you were in Seoul, you would never have lacked for a seat at any table. Your father was a giant among men." The photographers went into a frenzy. This wasn't just a reversal. It was a resurrection. The joke had been a diplomat's daughter in hiding. The joke was a woman whose pedigree made everyone in the room look like nouveau riche pretenders. Min Seo's knees buckled. She reached out for a nearby table to steady herself, her fingers slipping on the polished surface. She looked at the cameras, realizing that every flash was a nail in the coffin of her reputation. Tomorrow, the headlines wouldn't be about her beauty or her gala. They would be about the woman who tried to bully a diplomat's daughter and ended up covered in her own spilled wine. Imani didn't stay to watch the final collapse. She didn't need to. She turned to Hyunwoo, who was watching her with an expression that could almost be described as pride. "I believe I've seen enough of this party," Imani said. "As have I," Hyunwoo replied. He offered his arm, not as a boss, but as a peer. Imani placed her hand on his sleeve, the deep red of her silk resting against the midnight black of his suit. Together, they began to walk toward the exit, moving through a sea of guests who were now bowing so low they were nearly double. Behind them, Min Seo sank to her knees among the shards of glass, her white suit ruined, her voice reduced to a broken sob that was drowned out by the relentless clicking of the cameras. She had wanted to create a spectacle, and she had succeeded. She was the talk of the town, just as she had always wanted. But as Imani stepped out into the cool night air, she didn't look back once. The maid was gone. The diplomat's daughter was back, and the wolves of Seoul had a new queen to fear. The cool night air of Seoul hit Imani's face like a benediction, washing away the cloying scent of lilies and expensive desperation that had clung to her in the ballroom. Behind her, the heavy doors of the Grand Magnolia closed with a final, echoing thud, muffling the chaotic sounds of Min Seo's downfall. The flashes of the cameras were still visible through the glass, but to Imani, they now looked like nothing more than dying stars in a fading galaxy. She stood on the top step of the grand entrance, her structured white cape catching the breeze. Beside her, Baek Hyun-woo remained a silent, formidable presence. He didn't ask where she wanted to go, nor did he offer a platitude about the night's victory. He simply watched the way she breathed in the night, recognizing the moment a person stops running and starts leading. "The car is waiting," Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. Imani looked out at the line of luxury sedans, their polished black chassis gleaming under the streetlights. For a year, she had entered buildings like this through the back, through the service alleys where the trash was kept and the invisible people gathered. She had spent a year looking at the world from the floor up. "I won't be returning to the penthouse, Mr. Beck," Imani said, her voice clear and resonant. She turned to look at him, her chin level, her eyes reflecting the neon glow of the city she had finally conquered. "I believe I've finished my cleaning." Hyun-woo gave a slow, rare nod. He reached into his jacket and produced a small, obsidian black card, handing it to her. It wasn't a business card. It was a master key, a symbol of his personal debt to her. "The world thinks they saw a maid become a queen tonight, but you and I both know you were never the maid. If you ever need to remind this city of that again, you have my number." Imani took the card, her fingers brushing against his. In that touch, there was a silent pact between two people who lived in the shadows but understood the light. "Thank you, Hyun-woo, for seeing me when I was trying my hardest not to be seen." He watched her descend the stairs, his observant gaze never wavering. He stood there until she reached the sidewalk, a dark sentinel guarding her exit from the life she was leaving behind. Imani didn't call a car. Instead, she began to walk. She walked past the high-end boutiques where she had once stared at dresses she couldn't afford, and past the sterile office towers where she had scrubbed the lobby floors. With every step, the weight of the last 12 months seemed to peel away. The Black Maid was a mask she was finally laying down, but the strength she had forged in that fire remained. She had learned the secrets of the powerful while she was beneath them. She knew their weaknesses, their fears, and the hollow nature of their arrogance. She reached the bridge overlooking the Han River and stopped, leaning against the cold stone railing. She reached into her bag and pulled out the old diplomatic passport and the emerald silk scarf. The scandal that had broken her father's heart and sent her into hiding hadn't changed the truth of who they were. The minister's recognition tonight had proved that a legacy isn't something that can be stolen by a headline. It is carried in the blood. She looked at her reflection in the dark, swirling water below. She saw the deep red of her gown, the sharpness of her bob, and the steady fire in her eyes. She wasn't just the diplomat's daughter anymore. She was a woman who had survived the wolves and come out leading the pack. "It's time, Dad," she whispered into the wind. She wouldn't be hiding in a studio apartment tomorrow. She would be calling the lawyers, the old allies, and the people Julian had mentioned. She would be clearing her father's name, not with a plea for mercy, but with the authority of a woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. She would rebuild the Walker legacy, but she would do it on her own terms, with the steel she had found in the darkest corners of Seoul. A black sedan pulled up quietly to the curb a few yards away. The door opened, and Julian St. Clair stepped out, his silver hair shimmering. He stood by the open door, his arms folded, a proud, knowing smile resting on his lips. "So," he said with a playful smirk, lifting one eyebrow. "Was it enough?" Imani looked back at the city lights, at the towers of Gangnam, and at the distant silhouette of the Grand Magnolia. They no longer looked like fortresses she had to scale. They looked like a playground. "No," she said quietly, her voice ringing with a new, terrifying strength. "It's not enough. This is just the beginning." Julian laughed and reached for her hand, squeezing it firmly as she stepped into the car. "Damn right. Let's go build something so big that no one will ever dare to forget your name again." As the car pulled away, the sun began to hint at the horizon, painting the sky with deep gold and soft orange, as if the world itself was acknowledging the shift in power. Imani sat by the window, watching her reflection in the glass. She didn't see a maid, or a victim, or a joke. She saw a woman who had been knocked down, but never lost her crown. A crown that no one had given her. And as the city woke up to a new day, she knew that no one would ever be able to take it away again. The reign of Imani Walker had officially begun. If you believe in stories that inspire, that challenge, that give voice to people the world often ignores, hit that subscribe button below. More powerful journeys are coming, and we'd love to have you with us.